going to be an exciting afternoon here and an exciting. We are billing this part of the program as the Friday night debates, and we're beginning not at night but at 1:30 in the afternoon on the topic of Islam, threat or not. To moderate the panel, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the war correspondent for World Net Daily, one of the most watched internet sites in the world, frequent traveler to Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Europe, where, among other things, he is a panelist on the French version of Meet the Press. So if you're a fan of Kiosk in Paris, you already know Matthew Sanchez. Please join me in welcoming him now, and the very difficult task of getting this program going. Okay.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a couple of personal comments. Before I became a war correspondent, I had the pleasure of going to Kuwait and going into Iraq with our troops, the American forces. And I met a lot of different people. My idea about Islam was very limited. But I recall being a Ramadi and celebrating Ramadan and being with a lot of different people who were Muslims, and just feeling how much it resembled Christmas. People got together, families ate, and it was a big celebration. There was nothing violent about it. That was always juxtaposed with acts of violence that took place from Islamists who, during that Ramadi celebration in 1997 of last year, exploded a car bomb and ended up killing the host of the party where I was that day, and that was a gentleman named Sheikh Sattar. So is Islam a threat, or is it a peaceful religion? Honestly, I couldn't tell you, and I think a lot of you are here asking some of the same questions. How much of a threat and how much of an involvement we in the United States will have with this force that seems to be growing. Here to discuss this are two gentlemen who are much more intelligent than I ever will be on the subject. I'm going to bring up Dr. Daniel Peterson. He's a professor of Islamic Studies at Brigham Young University. He has completed a biography on the life of Muhammad. To debate the doctor will be Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer, you may know him by some of the books that he has two New York Times bestsellers. One is The Truth About Muhammad, and he's also published The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. So these gentlemen will be debating, and hopefully will answer some of those questions that a lot of you here are wondering as well. At the very end, I hope to open up the debate to you and have you ask our panelists some questions. Okay, without any further ado, let's bring up Dr. Daniel Peterson from Brigham Young University.
There's no clear answer to the question whether Islam is violent or peaceful. For one thing, there's no single Platonic archetype somewhere out there called Islam. There are and always have been competing Islams, each claiming to be the authentic one, just as there's no single monolithic Judaism, but rather, as the great scholar Jacob Neusner has observed, Judaisms, and just as there are Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Quaker, and many other Christianities. Sunni Islam differs from Shia Islam, and Sunni Islam alone recognizes as orthodox four distinct schools of legal thought. And this isn't to mention Sufi or mystical Islam, which transcends the Sunni-Shiite divide, nor such sects as the Wahhabis and others. Further, the question's too black and white. Obviously, one cannot simplistically pronounce Islam a religion of peace. Muhammad was neither a proto-Gandhi nor some kind of 7th century Arabian flower child. But it's an equal and opposite error to depict Islam simplistically as an ideology of hatred, violence, and oppression. Like every other religious faith and every other institution involving humans, Islam's historical record is mixed. With those cautions stated, a better way of phrasing the topic of today's discussion would be, is Islam inherently violent in all its forms or not? To which my answer is no. Before I set forth some of my reasons for this answer in the painfully limited period allotted, so many disagreements, so little time, permit me to say where I'm not coming from. I'm neither a Muslim nor an apologist for Islam. I'm a believing Christian. Nor am I a left-winger or a cultural relativist. I don't believe that the Islamic world is beyond criticism, and I see much to criticize. I don't think that the connection between Islam and terrorist violence is accidental or coincidence. Moreover, I'm a movement conservative, for what it's worth, with libertarian leanings, a subscriber to National Review since I was 13, who supports the surge in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. I am, however, a student of Islam and of Islamic intellectual history. Muslims currently represent nearly a quarter of the human race, and they're not likely to go away anytime soon, nor are they likely to simply walk away from their faith. So my fundamental question to those who claim that Islam properly understood is inherently violent, that it's inescapably hostile to liberty and Western civilization, is this: what would you have us do? I don't suppose, though Sam Harris comes close, that anybody seriously proposes a Western war of annihilation against the world's roughly 1.3 billion Muslims. But if Islam is inherently violent and hostile, I see no real alternative to a permanent state of war between the West and Islam. I reject the idea. Unfortunately, though, I think that our harshest Western critics make such a clash of civilizations more likely. How? Because ironically, in privileging those readings of Islam that demand a permanent state of war between the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam or submission, and the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, a pair of entirely non-Quranic phrases, incidentally, they read it exactly as our most ardent and implacable enemies do. And in arguing that this is the only true and legitimate understanding of Islam, they agree with Sayyid Qutb, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and other extremists in declaring moderate Muslims to be kuffar, or infidels. This seems to me catastrophically wrong-headed, not only because it's historically mistaken, but perhaps even more importantly because it undercuts members of the Muslim community whom we ought to be cheering on. A few weeks ago I was driving with a Muslim friend in Jordan. We're living in a stupid period of Islamic history, he told me. I hope that people won't judge all of Islam, Islamic civilization, and Islamic history by this stupid period. To that, in the context of this discussion, I add my hope that we in the West won't do anything to support stupidity or to delegitimize intelligence among our Muslim neighbors. The old Latin precept, first do no harm, can and should apply to intercultural relations as well as to medicine. Modern mujahideen do not believe they are hijacking Islam, Robert Spencer rightly notes. They believe they're restoring its proper interpretation, and they're successfully convincing peaceful Muslims around the world that they're correct. And they will continue to do so for as long as peaceful Muslims fail to formulate new and non-literalist ways of interpreting the Quran and the words and deeds of Muhammad. In his books, however, Mr. Spencer effectively argues that the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda and their fellow travelers represent true Islam. Far from being extremists or perverters of the faith, he writes, they interpret its texts correctly. They are the people who actually dare to do what Allah says to do. He argues that non-Muslims who don't recognize this live in a fantasy world, and most crucially, that moderate Muslims, to the extent that they exist, are moderates either because they aren't serious Muslims or because they're ignorant of the real teachings of their faith. This is precisely the position of Sayyid Qutb and the other founders of today's militant Islamism. If true, it would be deeply disheartening. It would suggest that if Muslims learn about their faith and follow it, they must logically practice the jihadi extremist form of Islam. In my judgment, however, this idea is not true. As outlined in John Kelsey's important book, Arguing the Just War in Islam, there's a serious intra-Islamic conversation going on, and the moderates have a case. And I could not possibly disagree more strongly with Mr. Spencer and the Wahhabis when they claim that the mystical or Sufi tradition of Islam, which has often expressed itself peacefully and tolerantly, is not true Islam. To oppose aggressive military jihad, Mr. Spencer says, would be to turn against Islam itself. In seeing the war on terror as not just as a war against Islam, but as a war on behalf of Christianity, Mr. Spencer writes, the view of bin Laden and other jihad terrorists neatly coalesces with that of the anti-Christian theocracy writers like Chris Hedges and Kevin Phillips. Mr. Spencer's full-throated, sustained defense of the Crusades as justified defensive warfare, and his expressions of gratitude to the Crusaders, suggest that he, Hedges, Phillips, and Osama aren't so very far apart on this matter. And no Muslim who opens to the frontispiece of Mr. Spencer's politically incorrect guide to Islam to see the two words that appear alone and in all capital letters on it, Deus vult, is likely to be reassured. Deus vult, Latin for God wills it, was the cry of the people at the declaration of the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095. Even many conservatives shy away from naming the enemy, Mr. Spencer writes, for fear that it means war against 1 billion Muslims. But if Mr. Spencer's arguments are granted, doesn't it? It's a PC myth, he has written, in the context of a discussion not of fringe terrorists, but of mainstream Islam and Islamic history, that we can negotiate with these people, quote unquote. Even many conservatives shy away from naming the enemy, Mr. Spencer writes, for fear that it means war against 1 billion Muslims. But if Mr. Spencer's arguments are granted, doesn't it? It's a PC myth, he has written, in the context of a discussion not of fringe terrorists, but of mainstream Islam and Islamic history, that we can negotiate with these people, quote unquote. There's scarcely a single ray of light in Mr. Spencer's relentlessly negative portrayal of Islam and Islamic civilization, which seem beyond redemption, and which it appears must be utterly repudiated. Accordingly, for example, Muslim Spain and the Ottoman Empire, widely recognized by mainstream scholars as relatively tolerant places compared with then contemporary Europe, weren't tolerant at all. Islamic law, lie, steal, and kill, reads one of his chapter headings. He even denigrates Muslim contributions to science and philosophy. It is thus stunningly ironic to read Mr. Spencer's lament that, quote, Islamic theology so devalues non-believers that there's no room in Islamic culture for any generosity toward their achievements, end quote. There seems no place at all in Mr. Spencer's world for believing Muslims. As long as men read and believe the Quran, Mr. Spencer writes in his politically incorrect guide, women will be despised second-class citizens, subject to the loss of virtually all of the most basic human freedoms. The war on terror, he declares in the opening sentence of his book Religion of Peace, is an ideological conflict, one in which Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, secular Muslims, and others have a stake. Notice that while secular Muslims are included as potential allies, believing Muslims are conspicuously omitted. And now a few points of many. The Quran, says Mr. Spencer, exhorts believers to fight unbelievers. The commands taken at face value are open-ended and universal. However, it's just as possible to take them as exhortations to fight specific hostile unbelievers in Arabia in the early 7th century, neither open-ended nor universal. It's essential to know the context of Quranic verses, what Muslims call the asbab an-nuzul, the reasons for sending down or occasions of revelation. Mr. Spencer puts aggressive military jihad at the absolute heart of Islam, suggesting that doing otherwise is untrue to the classical texts. But the 8th century jurist Ibn Jurayj regarded prayer and mosque attendance as more important and did not consider jihad obligatory for all. Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and At-Tirmidhi report a saying of Muhammad indicating that helping widows and the poor is jihad. Another report has Muhammad telling a man to go home and care for his parents rather than going out to fight. The early jurist Sufyan al-Thawri believed that jihad was primarily defensive and that only defensive jihad was obligatory upon individual Muslims. So did the prominent 20th century rector of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Muhammad Shaltut. Mr. Spencer says that the Quranic phrase jihad fi sabilillah, striving in the path of God, means armed struggle to establish the hegemony of the Islamic social order. This is, to say the least of it, debatable. The Arabic word jihad means simply striving. The Musannaf of Abd al-Razak in the 9th century, for instance, in addition to the military defense of Islamic lands, offers striving daily to live righteously through acts of worship as a specimen of jihad, along with earning a legal livelihood and serving one's family. Other early sources mention the pursuit of knowledge, spending money on a good cause, prayer, giving alms, and even patience or patient endurance as examples of non-military jihad. Curiously, the word harb, or war, is never conjoined with the term jihad in the Quran. Mr. Spencer writes of Muhammad's alleged ambitions of world domination. However, modern scholars like Montgomery Watt and Karl Ernst reject them as later retrojections from the imperial period. Even if the voices of moderation are rare, muted, and too often in exile, which I grant, there's a genuine discussion going on within Islam. John Kelsey's Arguing the Just War in Islam, Karl Ernst's Following Muhammad, Rethinking Islam in the Contemporary World, are two recent books that chronicle portions of that discussion. The essays gathered in Charles Kurtzman's source book entitled Liberal Islam, and Asma Sfaruddin's admirable new book, The First Muslims, History and Memory, are illustrations of it. Scholars like Ghulam Ahmed, Abdulaziz Sachedina, the late Fazlur Rahman, UCLA's Khalid Abul Fadl figure in it. Ali Abdul Razik argued that no particular form of government is required by Islam, that a social order compatible with Islam simply requires justice and equity. There's considerable debate about the reliability of the hadith, which have been used to justify jihadi violence. The contemporary Iranian philosopher Abdul Karim Soroush argues for the legitimacy of religious pluralism, and in North Africa, Muhammad Talbi contends Islamically for religious liberty. We should be careful not to undercut such people, nor to award the victor's crown to their opponents. They have a difficult enough challenge as it is. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate enough to have Robert Spencer himself to respond to some of the accusations and some of the statements Dr. Peterson made. I also want to point out that Robert Spencer will be available to the public at a book signing after this, 415, booth 415. And without further ado, the director of the Jihad Watch, which is a news and commentary site that's updated daily, Robert Spencer.
Thank you. So many things to say in so little time. The question is whether to speak about the elements of Islam that are used by jihadists to justify violence and supremacism and oppression in various ways is to validate those interpretations of Islam and to undercut those Muslims who are trying to reform those things. This is a very important question, and I don't think that it can be approached unless we have an accurate understanding of the facts on the ground. Dr. Peterson quite correctly stated at the beginning of his talk that there is no single Islam, that there is in the first place the Sunni and Shiite divide, and in the second place 4 schools of Sunni jurisprudence, as well as other schools of jurisprudence. He did not mention, however, that there is a broad consensus, and consensus is a very important, ijma is a very important concept in Islamic theology. Muhammad prophesied that his community would not agree on an error. And so what is reached as a point of consensus by the various schools of Islamic law is considered to be a question that is settled and sure. Now, this is Islamic theology. This is not my opinion. These are matters of record that the schools of Islamic jurisprudence do agree and have a consensus on the necessity to wage war against unbelievers. Dr. Peterson mentioned the 4 schools of Sunni jurisprudence, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali. All of them agree that jihad is a precept of divine institution, that it is preferable to first invite the non-Muslims to accept Islam, and if they refuse, to fight them. I am quoting in part the words of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, who was a Maliki jurist, the jurist from one of these schools of jurisprudence. And Qayrawani was actually working from the words of Muhammad himself, as recorded in the Hadith collection Sahih Muslim, when he said to meet the unbelievers, invite them to accept Islam. If they refuse, invite them to enter the Islamic social order as the dhimmis, the second-class citizens, as mandated by Islamic law in an institutionalized status of discrimination. They would not enjoy equality of rights under the law with the Muslims, and if they refuse both, to go to war with them. Conversion, subjugation, or war being set out by Muhammad in what are considered to be canonical hadith that are authentic by all the schools of Islamic law and all the orthodox sects of Islam. Now, a lot of the confusion comes from the difficulty of dealing with these facts. This is not to say that no modern reformers exist. It is to say that it is an element of traditional and mainstream Islam and a point of agreement among the various differing sects of Islam that warfare against unbelievers and their subjugation under the rule of Islamic law is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community. Now, he says that if this is true, Dr. Peterson says that this would be very disheartening. Unfortunately, there are some truths that are disheartening. And what we have to do is realistically work from that point to try to come up with some kind of a solution that is actually workable, rather than retreat into fantasies, half-truths, and deceptions that are much more comforting, much more heartening, but unfortunately false. Unfortunately, there are some truths that are disheartening. And what we have to do is realistically work from that point to try to come up with some kind of a solution that is actually workable, rather than retreat into fantasies, half-truths, and deceptions that are much more comforting, much more heartening, but unfortunately false. Now, in this case, if there is a permanent state of war existing between the House of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, and the House of War, the Dar al-Harb, which is us, then it is because Muslims who believe these teachings are waging it and always have been waging it. And the only times in history when there has not been widespread jihad violence in the world is at times when the Islamic community was too weak to put it forward, but not because there was any large-scale reform of these teachings, rejection of these teachings, even reconsideration of these teachings. This is not to say that every Muslim in the world is our enemy, should be our enemy, or ever will be fighting against us. Because as in Islam, as in every other religious tradition, there is a spectrum of belief, of knowledge, and of fervor. There are many millions of people around the world, billions in fact, who call themselves Christians. And yet, to assume that they all agree on Christian doctrine or that they all will act upon Christian doctrines that they agree on would be absurd. There is a huge variation in how those people who call themselves Christians live out their Christianity, or are Christians essentially in name only and ignore part or all of it. It's the same way in Islam. These things are teachings of all the schools of Islamic law. These things are manifestly taught in the Quran. They are taught in the example of Muhammad, who has Uswa Hasanah, the perfect example, the supreme, excellent example of conduct as specified in the Quran, is to be imitated, held up as a model for emulation in Islamic theology. And as these things are taught, then there are people who will take them seriously. There are people who will not take them seriously. There are people who will hear them and believe them, but not be willing to give up their comfortable lives. They just want to have a job and a family. They just want to be left alone. They can't really be bothered with all these theological issues. There is also, because of the great Western influence, including the influence of Western pop culture, which has been so derided in the Islamic world, there is also a widespread acceptance of Western sentiments, of Western notions of human rights that are at variance with classical notions of Islamic law. The Quran, not Spencer, not some extremists, mandates amputation of the hand for theft. That's chapter 5, verse 38. The Hadith, the Islamic traditions, and Islamic law are unanimous on that. They are unanimous on the stoning of adulterers. They are unanimous on the institutionalized subjugation of women in many ways. But the Islamic world is not hermetically sealed. Western ideas have come in, and there are millions, hundreds of millions of Muslims who do subscribe to Western notions of human rights, Western notions of the dignity of all people and the equality of rights of all people before the law. These people can be our allies, but both within the Islamic world and in terms of the Islamic world's relations to the West, these things cannot come about if we don't acknowledge the situation first. You can't reform what you won't admit needs reforming. You can't fix what you won't admit is broken. The reformers, such as Khalid Abu al-Fadl, whom Dr. Peterson mentioned, are actually people who are not the kind of reformer you would expect. If you're familiar with European history, you're familiar with the Protestant Reformation, whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant, or whether you were neither, then you may know that the Protestant reformers pointed out elements of Catholic theology that they rejected, and they taught against them. They fought against them. They said, we do not believe and we do not think that the Church ought to teach transubstantiation, papal authority, veneration of Mary, and so on. They did not say, these elements of Christianity do not exist and have never existed, and anybody who thinks so is just helping the extremists. And it's the same way today. If we're going to really help genuine Islamic reformers, we shouldn't, then we cannot take those people, and there are many, including some that Dr. Peterson mentioned, who are saying that these elements of Islam do not exist and have never existed. That's not reform, that's deception. We can take as allies those who say there are these elements of Islam and they need to be rethought. There needs to be a fundamental reassessment of how we take even the literal words of the Quran, and there may need to be a retreat from, an explicit retreat from literalism in several particulars. But this problem will never go away. This problem will not be solved. This problem will continue to recur if we, in the first place, forbid ourselves from speaking about it, and we end up pretending that it doesn't exist and accepting the comforting half-truths and inaccurate formulations of people who have not actually confronted the reality of these things. Just for example, Dr. Peterson mentioned that there are interpretations of the Quran that are put forward by the jihadists today, and that I am endorsing them and validating them supposedly by writing about them and reporting on them. And that he reminds me that we have to take into account the Asbab an-Nuzul, which is the context of the various verses of the Quran. Well, let me give you a little lesson in Asbab an-Nuzul right here, just very briefly. Ibn Ishaq, the first biographer of Muhammad in the 8th century, a pious Muslim, explains the contexts of various Quranic verses about warfare, not necessarily about jihad. As Dr. Peterson points out quite rightly, jihad means struggle. There are many struggles in Arabic, just as there are many struggles in English. You can struggle to quit smoking, and you can have a great struggle against the communist world. It's the same word. But there's no doubt that jihad warfare is an element of this, and there's more. Ibn Ishaq says there are places in the Quran where Muhammad, the Quran teaches peace. Surah 109 of the Quran says, say to the unbelievers, you have your religion and I have mine. Essentially, let's leave each other alone. That's great. I can go for that. But Ibn Ishaq says there are also portions of the Quran which teach warfare, which say fight against those who have fought against you, but do not begin hostilities. And then that's chapter 2, verse 190. And then there are further passages, such as chapter 9, verse 29, which says, fight against the people of the book, that's Jews and Christians primarily, until they pay the jizya, which is the tax, the religion-based tax, specified in Islamic law, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. In other words, fight against the Jews and Christians until they submit to the rule of the Muslims. Now, Ibn Ishaq says, in context, the first set of verses, the ones that are broadly tolerant, came from the early part of Muhammad's career when he was a preacher, he was not a military leader, and he was essentially powerless. Then, when he moved to Medina and he became for the first time a political and military leader, he began to tell the Muslims to defend themselves, and that's the second stage of Quranic revelation, according to Ibn Ishaq, not to Spencer, of the teachings on jihad. And finally, he says that the Quran, because the Muslims are the best of people, that's chapter 3, verse 110, and the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings, that's chapter 98, verse 6, therefore, the Muslims must fight in order to extend their hegemony over the world, because this is the law of God, and they have the responsibility to spread the law of God everywhere. Now, in other words, what he's saying is there are 3 stages of Quranic development on warfare, and the third and final stage that is applicable for all time is warfare against unbelievers. I didn't make that up. That is the earliest biographer of Muhammad. Every biographer of Muhammad since then, including Dr. Peterson, has to rely, at least in part, on his writings. And that theological point that he makes about the context of the Quranic verses is mainstream Islam, taught by all the schools of Islamic law. I am all for Muslims who reject that. I am all for Muslims who say we have to move beyond that. But I do not trust Muslims who say that does not exist and that is not so. That is not reform. Again, that is deception. We need not to be deceived here. We cannot afford to allow ourselves to be deceived. And as Muhammad said, war is deceit. And that deception, deliberate lying is allowed in times of warfare, in which we are manifestly in one today, or many Muslims believe we are, and when Muslims are under pressure from unbelievers, as specified by Quran chapter 3, verse 28, they may pretend to be their friends while actually working against them. These things have to be recognized as being elements of Quranic teaching, the teachings of Muhammad, the teachings of Islamic law. Without that first recognition, there can be no genuine reform and no genuine movement toward any kind of resolution of this conflict. And one thing we can be certain of in that event is that if voices like Dr. Peterson's prevail, the war will continue and intensify for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
All right. The last time these two gentlemen met up, Dr. Peterson and Mr. Spencer, for the most part, agreed. They had a debate on a radio station. Today, Dr. Peterson would like to ask Mr. Spencer a couple of questions. We'll take it from there. Also, afterwards, I want to open up the questions to the audience. There are 2 microphones in the middle aisle, and we'll have a Q&A session with the audience afterwards, so you can ask both our panelists your questions. Right. Dr. Peterson, you can start.
Okay. I assume this is on, yeah. I wonder if I could just respond to some things that were said. First of all, I want to stress, I am not one of those living in this fantasy world who thinks that Islam is peaceful right now. I think the Islamic world is dysfunctional right now, and clearly that the militant voices have the upper hand. They're winning. And the moderates, the people that I would like to see win, are on the defensive, if they're even doing that well. In many places, they're simply silent for various reasons, some of which are understandable and some of which bother me exceedingly much. I'm not opposed to Mr. Spencer's critique of Islam on many levels. I think it's sort of a bracing tonic, and I think there's much that the Islamic world needs to do to respond to the sort of critique that comes from Mr. Spencer. My problem with a lot of what he's done, I think, is not so much that it's wrong as that it's selective, that it's a prosecutor's brief, which has its legitimate function. But there's some things I'd like to say. I see my position, we're not really so much opposed here. You know, if this debate were a debate between polar opposites, you'd have someone arguing that Islam was intrinsically violent and someone arguing that it's intrinsically peaceful. I'm not going to argue that. I think that the elements justifying warfare are definitely there. This is certainly a very important part of the Islamic tradition, and it's something that Muslims need to deal with. My simple argument is that there's a lot of material there, and it's legitimate, it's in the tradition, that can be used by moderates. Yes, there is a broad consensus, and has been for a long time, about certain elements of jihadi teaching. I'd like to point out, though, that formulations like the opposition between the binary opposition between the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam, the abode of war and the abode of submission, that opposition is something that dates really to about 2 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. Much of Islamic law relative to jihad and almost everything else was formulated during an imperial period, an expansionist period. You can see the jurists who are doing this as the kind of hawkish, pro-establishment party. Giving comfort to the enemy here. But this is the war party, and they're currying favor in some senses, I think, with the establishment, with the regime, by justifying what the regime is doing. But all I really need to do to demonstrate there are peaceful elements within Islam is to show that there are some out there. It's like trying to disprove the proposition that all crows are black. All I have to do is show one white crow, and I've succeeded. So in that sense, I've got a modest task here. Let me just go over a couple of the verses that are mentioned. For example, it's said that the Quran explicitly teaches never-ending warfare against unbelievers. That is one of the things I expressly denied in my opening statement. The Quran, you could read it as simply referring to the specific wars that Muhammad was involved in 7th century Arabia. To generalize from that to a state of never-ending war against all the rest of the non-Muslim world is not a necessary entailment of those passages. Now, that it has been the entailment for a lot of Muslims, maybe the dominant tradition, is no doubt true. But I think there are other ways of reading it. For example, the so-called sword verse, Quran 9:5, reads, "And when the sacred months are over, slay the polytheists wherever you find them. Take them captive, besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every conceivable place." But the references in that verse to polytheists, it's not just non-believers, it's polytheists. And the reference to the sacred months make it clear this verse refers specifically to the pagan Arabs of Muhammad's time. And in fact, that's how many early scholars, such as Muqatil ibn Sulaiman in the 8th century, the great At-Tabari, the greatest of the Quran commentators, died in the early 10th century, that's how they understood it. The verse that Mr. Spencer expressly quoted, conjoined with the sword verse, is Quran 9:29, which reads, "Fight against those who, despite having been given revelation before, do not believe in God nor in the last day, and do not consider forbidden that which God and His messenger have forbidden, and do not follow the religion of the truth until they pay the jizya with willing hand, having been subdued." Now this verse obviously doesn't refer to all Christians and Jews, but only to those who disbelieve in God and fail to forbid evil. Contrast what Quran 3 verses 113 through 115 says about devoted Christians and Jews. They are not all the same. Among the people of the book are a contingent who stand in prayer, reciting the verses of God at all times of the night while they prostrate themselves. These are they who believe in God on the last day, and enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. They hasten to perform good deeds, they are among the righteous. And whatever they do of goodwill will not be rejected by God, and God knows best who are the God-fearing. So this idea that it's a blanket invitation to war against all Christians and Jews seems to me, even if many Muslims have taken it that way, seems to me one that you can construct a legitimate argument against. And I'm just hoping for the success of people who will make that argument. Sorry.
Thanks for the pen. So am I, hoping for the success of people who make that argument. But once again, my constant refrain is in this, let's not kid ourselves. There are other ways of reading the Quran. Sure, I am all for somebody coming in tomorrow and making up a whole new way to read the Quran to eliminate the power of any of these verses and many others that we could quote to incite people to violence and to make them pursue a supremacist agenda against the West. But the fact is that the mainstream understanding, as Dr. Peterson has conceded, of these verses is not that way. We can make up pretty things out of the Quran all that we want, but the only reason to even perform the exercise would be to help Muslims to actually understand the Quran this way. And for example, you take some of the things that Dr. Peterson has pointed out, that chapter 9 verse 29 refers only, as he says, to fighting against those Jews and Christians who disbelieve in Allah. Well, since Allah is just the word for God, it might seem nice if you stop there, because you think, well, Jews and Christians by definition believe in God, and so that means they're only fighting against Jews and Christians who perhaps aren't very religious. But the reality of the situation is, it says, fight against the people of the book, that is the Jews and Christians, who disbelieve in Allah and His messenger. That is the Jews and Christians who disbelieve in Allah and Muhammad. The Jews and Christians, in other words, who have the temerity not to convert to Islam. They are the ones who have to be fought. And that would be all those who remain Jews and Christians and don't become Muslims. This is validated by many, many hadith and many, many statements of the tafsir, the commentaries on the Quran, and Islamic law and history. It's very comforting, perhaps, to read. I can give you a verse you could use. It says chapter 2, verse 62, which says that the believers, Jews and Christians and Sabaeans, nobody knows exactly who Sabaeans were, but Jews and Christians we know, will go to paradise. And that sounds great. How wonderful and ecumenical. Until you read the commentaries, such as that by Ibn Kathir, who is mainstream accepted commentator on the Quran, and the Tafsir al-Jalalain, which is another one, another commentary that is very widely accepted and respected by Muslims. And they both say, the Jews and Christians who go to heaven are the ones who convert to Islam. The bad ones stay Jews and Christians. I didn't ever say a lot of things that have been attributed to me today, but I didn't say that there were no peaceful elements of Islam. There are many peaceful elements of Islam. But the fact that the Nazis did social services doesn't mean they didn't incinerate Jews. There are peaceful elements of Islam and wonderful elements of Islam. Beautiful. I wouldn't have studied Islam all these years if there weren't so many beautiful and compelling elements within it. But here again, we can't kid ourselves. There are also violent and supremacist elements of it that do exist and that Muslims believe. And no matter how we may make up some nice ways to get around them, until Muslims worldwide on a widespread basis start formulating those same kinds of ways to get around them, then we're just playing games and making ourselves feel better. And what is it? What's the expression? Playing shuffleboard on the bridge of the Titanic. There's no doubt that the doctrines of warfare were indeed, as Dr. Peterson points out, formulated several centuries after Muhammad's death, and that they were formulated during an imperial period. There's also no doubt that they've never been reformed or rejected, and that the apparatus to do so does exist. There are still these schools of jurisprudence operating, and not one of them has ever said, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't wage war against unbelievers in order to establish the hegemony of Islamic law against them. They had a golden opportunity to do this, as a matter of fact, after 9/11, when there were people who were pointing out that these doctrines existed. Then was the time when the New York Times went to Al-Azhar University in Cairo and said it was a beacon of moderation, trying to teach Muslims that warfare was not the way to go. And Al-Azhar University in Cairo has given its endorsement to a manual of Islamic law that says very clearly that the Muslim community must wage war against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they either become Muslim or pay the non-Muslim poll tax, the jizya, that we've both mentioned. Now, they could have rescinded their endorsement of such ideas at that time. They could have backed up the New York Times wishful thinking and shown themselves in some way to be moderate. They did not do so. And there still continues to be no major Islamic authority that has done so. And so what I am doing in my work is not trying to make the case any better or worse than it is. And I invite any fair-minded person to look at the books that I've written I never actually say, contrary to Dr. Peterson's claim, that the jihadist version of Islam is the true Islam. There is no central authority in Islam. There's no Islamic pope. And there is no person who can pronounce and say, this is real Islam and this isn't. But there's no doubt that the jihadists are using the claim that they represent the true Islam and are buttressing that claim by reference to these traditional elements of Islam to gain recruits around the Islamic world. Until we recognize that and challenge it, rather than try to wish it away, it will continue.
Dr. Peterson, you've mentioned on several occasions that this may just be a misunderstanding between the Western world and non-Muslims and Muslims. How do you contend that we should deal with the threat of terrorism in places not just inside countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, but where it's been exported abroad? We've seen it in England, France, of course in the United States. How do you explain the phenomenon of terrorism? How should the United States or even Western nations respond to that threat?
Well, I don't see it as a misunderstanding between Muslims and non-Muslims. I see it as, there really is. I mean, in a sense, we are really not disagreeing that much, except I do object to the idea that I'm making up pretty things in the Quran, playing games, wishing it away. I'm not. I have a pretty cold, realistic view of the Islamic world. Terrorism, Islamic terrorism, really does have roots in actual parts of the tradition of Islam. I'm simply arguing there are people out there, no major schools yet, and no authorities. There is no Islamic pope to, for example, to issue some sort of encyclical denouncing terrorism. Nobody has that kind of authority. But there are voices out there, and some pretty prominent ones, who have come out, even some pretty anti-American sheikhs in Saudi Arabia, were critical of the 9/11 attacks, for example. Not as critical as I would like them to be, but they were critical of those attacks because of their assault on because of their assault on civilians and so on and so forth, and their failure to discriminate between military combatants and others. How would I like to see us respond? I think that there's, I've said already that I'm a supporter of the surge and I'm a supporter of the war in Afghanistan. I think a major military response is necessary in some areas. I think we ought also to be fighting the war of ideas in various ways, which we're not doing. At one point, I was told that the U.S. was actually cutting back on broadcasting of idea programs into the Middle East and was broadcasting American popular culture. For example, and I'm not making this up, Britney Spears. Now, I can't imagine a stupider policy than that, to reinforce all the Islamist stereotypes about the West. That's the kind of thing we've been doing. But there are elements, there are little tiny elements out there in this very dysfunctional period of Islamic history, little embers out there that I'd like to see us blow upon if we can, to fan them into life. I don't know how we can do that. It's a very difficult question. Because if these people are seen as somehow CIA supported or something like that, that's the kiss of death to them. But we ought to be encouraging, hoping for, doing everything we can to sort of support the mainstream, or the moderate reinterpretation of these elements in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition, and to reinforce those peaceful elements, which I insist I'm not making up. They are there. They're legitimate interpretations. Thank you very much. They're legitimate interpretations. I know I'm going to lose this debate, but it doesn't matter. think of me as a martyr. Thanks.
Don't do that.
Hold on. Gentlemen, afterwards you'll have time. You can go up to the microphone. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you do have questions, go ahead and line up behind the microphone. I promise I'll get to you.
You're just enhancing my martyr complex.
Okay.
At least he's not a jihadist martyr with bombs. I don't know.
I do want to ask question marks Robert Spencer, because this is important. He probably gets this criticism all the time. Your books are seen as provocative by a lot of people, and the doctor's making the point that there are moderate segments of Muslims, and that what you do, in fact, is that you polarize them, that books like The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and The Crusades actually takes those moderates and polarizes them and makes them even more pro-Islamic or even pro-terrorist, or if anything, they just drop out of the debate, which could be even worse. How do you respond to that, Robert?
Well, actually, I already have. I mentioned before, you can't fix what you would admit is broken. You can't reform what you would admit needs reforming. Any Muslim who genuinely rejects the elements of Islam that I'm speaking about shouldn't have any problem with my speaking about them. As a matter of fact, I take it as a kind of an index as to whether a reformer is sincere or is a deceiver if he professes offense at these things. Because the situation is that you have people who are claiming that these elements of Islam do not exist. And as I explained before, I don't think that that's reform at all. Just to pretend that they don't exist might be very comforting to Westerners who don't know whether they exist or not. But they will not keep the jihadists, who know very well that these elements of Islam exist, from continuing to exploit them. And so they have to speak about these things forthrightly. I also think it's beyond absurd to think that if you have a Muslim who abhors jihad violence and Islamic supremacism, that if I speak about these things, he will suddenly embrace jihad violence and Islamic supremacism. Also, I want to point out that Dr. Peterson and I both wish to blow on the embers of the reform, the very small groups and individuals, as he points out, or as he acknowledges, that are working to change what is in Islam and to mitigate these violent elements. But here again, I do not believe that can be done simply by sugarcoating the harsh realities of the situation, but by confronting them. And I appeal again to the historical analogy of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant reformers did not say, the church doesn't teach transubstantiation and papal authority, and anybody who says so is a hate monger and is going to make me become a Catholic. And that's the absurd situation we're in.
Now, let me just say that by portraying this, as some people do, the presentation I heard yesterday, I think, essentially hinted at this, presenting this as some sort of war between Christianity and Islam, between the West and Islam, we do sort of force some people who are Muslims, believing Muslims, if they believe the war is against Islam. And remember, a lot of people over there, it's not so much what the facts of the case really are. It's what they believe that may or may not be so that can affect their attitude toward things. If they see the West as engaged in a war against Islam, they will line up with Islam. The enemy of my enemy, so on and so forth.
That's an excellent point, Doctor. We have several guests who want to ask a question, so go ahead and step up and ask your question.
Both of the speakers have stated that there are small minorities within the
I'm sorry, sir. Speak up just a little bit.
Both of the speakers have stated that there are small minorities within Islam who are moderate. It seems to me that the extremists have terrorized the moderates to the point where they are totally powerless and are unwilling to speak up. Could you comment, please?
Yeah, that's quite so. Not only do they they make their appeal within the Islamic communities, that is, the jihadists make their appeal within Islamic communities on the basis of their Islamic authenticity, on the basis of saying that they represent true Islam, real Islam, and anybody who does not wage jihad against the West in some form, not necessarily violent form, but in some way trying to help the effort, is not an authentic Muslim. Not only do they do that, but they also pronounce the people who reject that, the Muslims who reject these ideas, to be apostate. And apostates, of course, according to Muhammad's own command, if anybody changes his religion, kill him. And according to all the schools of Islamic law, here again, and all the orthodox sects of Islam, apostates must be executed. Now, this doesn't mean that every apostate will be executed. Somebody has to care enough to carry out the sentence. But the sentence is there. And it does intimidate moderate Muslims. It is used to intimidate moderate Muslims. I'd like to point out also this is happening right here in the United States. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a Muslim, a very courageous man, who wrote an op-ed in the local paper denouncing Osama bin Laden, whereupon he was expelled from his mosque in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so if you think that the Muslims in the United States are free entirely from these ideas, remember that Sheikh Muhammad Hisham Kabani, himself a Muslim, a Sufi, which is, as Dr. Peterson said and accused me of not believing, a relatively peaceful sect. He testified before State Department Open Forum as long ago as 1999 that 80% of the mosques in the United States are under the control of extremists. This makes it very difficult for peaceful Muslims and genuine reformers to make any headway.
Dr. Peterson, same question. How do you marginalize the extremists and encourage the moderates?
Oh, I think it's very difficult, and I'm not sure how much we can really do, because once people are branded Western agents, their effectiveness within the Muslim community is doomed. I might say, by the way, there is another way of reading the, though I agree that the standard reading within the Islamic community of the prohibition against apostasy is there, that it deserves the death penalty. There's another way of reading that. The word that's used for apostasy is also related to the word for rebellion. In the early days of Islam, irtidad was not only apostasy, it was actually sedition. It was rebellion against legitimate legal authority, which was punishable by death. I think that this now rests on misreading, but unfortunately it's a widespread misreading.
1 minute.
Unanimous.
We have time for one last question. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it's a quick debate. Thank you very much for your question, sir. Sir?
Quick question for the panel. Isn't this really about a search for power, and whether it's dressed up as religion or whether it's dressed up as nationalism, looking at your example?
Excellent question. We have 1 minute left. Panelists? We have...
Non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, the believers are under the obligation to dislodge them from that power by any means possible. That is a quotation from Maulana Maududi, who died in 1979. He was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest Islamist political party in Pakistan. And that is the basis, on the basis of the Quran and so on, that there's no right for non-Muslims to have political power. And it is on that basis that they're fighting today.
Dr. Peterson, is this a power grab?
I'm sure it is. And I think religion is an incredibly powerful symbol system, and it's obviously something that resonates in the Middle East. I might note, by the way, that despite the fact that in theory, supposedly, according to Maududi, it's illegal for a non-Muslim to exercise power, the Prime Minister of Egypt in the medieval Islamic period was often Christian. Many of the wazirs in medieval Islamic Spain were Jewish.
Ladies and gentlemen...
Because they were Jewish. And
Nevertheless,
4,000 people killed in Granada in 1066.
We're going to have to cut it there. It's a long debate.